What's up, dudes? So I wanted to go ahead and just make a quick video today to cover a question that's been brought up fairly frequently as of late, and that is the issue of whether or not there's any noteworthy difference between using generic finasteride versus using brand name finasteride. Obviously, most people would probably prefer to use generic finasteride like I do. I use generic Proscar specifically that comes in a 5 milligram tablet, which I then quarter into 1.25 milligram sections, and that is by far the cheapest way to take finasteride, as it only cost me $9 for 30 pills, which was then quartered, which will last me about 4 months before I need to refill my prescription. And this has always worked for me, and with a few brief exceptions, such as when I traveled overseas, I didn't have access to my regular pharmacy, this 5 milligram quarter generic Proscar is all I've ever used when taking finasteride. Naturally, a cheaper version of a brand name product would be a better deal, but that is only if what we are getting is just as effective, and that is what I want to address today. Is generic finasteride as good as brand name finasteride? The short answer to this is yes. It is as good, it is just as effective, but keep in mind that doesn't mean that generics and brand name versions of finasteride are exactly the same, only that their outcomes in patients will be just as good, and I'm going to explain my findings on that. So, in order for an FDA-approved drug to become a generic, it has to go off patent. Newer drugs don't typically have generics because they're still on patent, but for older drugs like finasteride that have been around since 1992, generics are now widely available. The way that works, in the USA at least, is there is this law called the Hatch-Waxman Act, which was passed in 1984, and it was designed to encourage the development of generic drugs by allowing the generic companies to work on developing their drugs before the patent expired, so they can release their generic variant as soon as the patent expires. But it also required that the generic companies release information showing that the drug is the bioequivalent to the patented drug. So what does the term bioequivalent mean? It doesn't mean bioidentical, so there could be some negligible differences between a generic and a brand name version of a drug like finasteride, but the end result is exactly the same, meaning it has the exact same safety profile and efficacy, and any differences between the two are too small to make a difference. So, what differences are allowed between generics and brand name drugs that allow a generic to be considered bioequivalent? Well, there is an FDA study that found that the average difference in the drug content between the patented drug and the generic drug was only about 3.5%, and 80% of the products tested had a difference of less than 5%. So the vast majority of generic drugs are effectively equal in the amount of active ingredient that they contain. I should further add that if you're using something like generic Proscar, for instance, where the quarter dosage is 1.25 milligram, then even when the difference is 3.5%, you're still getting a little more than the standard dose, which is 1 milligram. So assuming these differences apply to a generic quarter Proscar, it would mean you're getting a dose between 1.21 to 1.29 milligrams, because keep in mind that a 3.5% difference doesn't necessarily mean it is lower. It could be 3.5 percentage points higher as well. What is important, though, is that 3.5% difference is not going to matter in terms of efficacy and safety, hence why the FDA allows that much variation. I can also guarantee you that no matter how precisely you quarter your Proscar tablet, there is no way you're going to get exactly 1.25 milligram dosage anyways. Chances are you'll have a margin of several tenths of a milligram, even if the cut looks virtually exact. The same thing would apply to people who use less than the standard 1 milligram per day dose of finasteride quartering generic Propecia, but it's not like people suddenly lose their results or get side effects because their dosage is only a few tenths of a milligram off. And if you are a finasteride user who is worried about side effects, chances are you are already cutting your pills to begin with to take less than the standard dose, so you will inevitably be having these tiny variations like we see in generic finasteride to begin with. Let me tell you though, it doesn't freaking matter. Finasteride is a very effective drug, and it's been shown that even doses as small as 0.2 milligrams suppress only about 20% less DHT than 5 milligrams of finasteride. So the drug is clearly not very dose dependent to begin with, so what's a couple tenths of a milligram difference going to make anyways? Alright, so brand name Propecia, as you guys know, is the 1 milligram tablet, and unfortunately it can cost up to $75 per month. What I take is generic Proscar, and that costs me only $9 per month. Literally the only difference between the two drugs I'm talking about is the price, as well as a dosing difference, which is quantifiably Irrelevant, completely negligible. Now, I know people will tell me that they've seen people who claim that they've switched brand names to generics or sometimes from generics to brand names, and they notice a change in their side effect profile or the effectiveness of their drug, but none of these claims are substantiated by scientific evidence. This is just weak anecdotal data. People who are scared that generics aren't good enough are likely going to be people who will give themselves a nocebo effect by imagining side effects if they are generics. Now, we know, like I already said, that finasteride is not very dose dependent, meaning you have to take large amounts of it to notice any difference beyond just the 0.2 milligrams that I mentioned earlier. So there is no reason to believe that a 3.5% difference in the active ingredient would have any varying effect whatsoever. Finasteride is a fantastic drug. It works extremely well, and I've said that many, many times before, and it is especially fortunate that we can now acquire it for such an inexpensive price. So I think this obsession over the minuscule chemical variations between generic and brand name finasteride is not doing the hair loss community any good. Both work just as well, and if people want to claim otherwise, the burden of proof is on them, because as of now, there is no evidence that generics are any less or more effective or safe than brand name treatments. So you might as well just go ahead and save some money and just stick with the generic versions of the drug. I mean, if there was any difference, the FDA would have modified their guidelines many years ago, because remember, generic equivalents are available for most drugs, not just finasteride. This includes drugs that are critical for life, such as heart drugs or cancer drugs and others. And if the standards for generics are good enough for these drugs, we're taking them as a matter of life or death. Certainly they are good enough for treating a cosmetic problem, namely hair loss, even though I'd argue that's probably a life or death issue as well. So, I just want to go ahead and quickly address that subject while I'm in the middle of trying to have lesbian sex with Judy from Cyberpunk 2077. So I hope that answered your guys' question on the matter, and hope you found the video interesting. I'll talk to you later. Take care.